welcome back to Break It to Make It. Here we meet amazing and interesting people who challenge us in the most extraordinary ways. We're going to meet people who've thrown out the rule book, failed forwards, or taken the road less traveled to come out on top. Have you ever had a gut-wrenching experience, or do certain situations make you feel nauseous, or have you ever been so excited that you felt butterflies in your tummy? Today we are following up on our Food for Thought podcast with a friend of the show, and we're going to be talking about the mind-gut connection, why it's important, and why it is so much more than just a collection of phrases that has entered the collective psyche. So, our guest, as I mentioned, friend of the show, she's a former psychologist turned nutritional neuroscientist and an author, and she has dedicated her life to examining the science behind how lifestyle factors and nutrition impact brain and its function. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Delia McCabe.
Thank you, Fallon. I'm delighted to be here.
It is so great. And last time, anybody who listens to the show would have noticed that we went over because there's just so much to talk about. And your episode was so popular and we all wanted to learn so much more that we made a date to bring you back. And we're talking about the gut. Like last time, I think I'm a bit of a noob when it comes to learning about all of these things. Let's start all the way back at microbes. And I understand that those are the things that live in your gut. And is it true that they can actually influence your feelings and your behaviors?
Absolutely. It's a fascinating conversation. And once again, it's a huge conversation. But let's just start with those little microbes or those little bacteria. We're supposed to have researchers argue about this. We're supposed to have between 500 to 4,000 different varieties of these bacteria. And these bacteria are critically important because they take the food that we eat and they break that food down. So let's just dispel one myth right now. We aren't what we eat, we are what we absorb. So we are actually what we digest and absorb. And that's where the bacteria play their role. They take that food, they break it down into smaller and smaller components so that those components can cross over the gut lining and find their way into our bloodstream. And then they can nourish our body and our brain. But they need to be broken down really well. And we need enough of them, enough of a variety of them to break all the different kinds of food that we eat down properly so that we can absolutely, absorb it and that it can cross into the bloodstream. So those bacteria, if we have the right ratio of them and the right quantity of them, they do their jobs beautifully. And they create things like short chain fatty acids. They help with the release of certain nutrients like vitamin K, vitamin A, some E, some of the Bs. They're also responsible for creating a mucus that keeps that gut lining really healthy so it doesn't get leaky. Now, leaky is a word that a lot of people associate with the gut, and we can come back to that later, Fallon. But yes, those little microbes are extremely important because they've got all of these different roles to play that really influence what kind of nutrients get into the bloodstream. And it's also important just to mention here, to give listeners an idea of the size of the gut. If we had to open up our small and our large intestine and our stomach, and we had to lay it down flat, open, it would cover a double bed. So that just gives you an idea of the scope of this organ. And this organ works in relation to the immune system. So the immune system is involved with the gut. The central nervous system is involved with the gut. And the hormonal system, that's the endocrine system, is involved with the gut. So we've got all of these different systems that work together with these bacteria to make sure that the gut works really well. So it's a really complex process happening when we put something into our mouth, we chew it and we swallow it.
I have so many questions running through my head. One of them is, as you're mentioning that connection and the immune system, I think back to some of my personal experiences of, say, having a bacterial infection and being prescribed antibiotics. And like so many other people, depending on what it is, you sometimes get GI upset because of that. And I've heard that can remove some of the good bacteria. And one of my fears is, Well, what happens if it goes away? Can we grow it back?
Okay, great question, and a really important one, because yes, those antibiotics definitely do destroy a number of the bacteria in the gut. And that's one of the problems that people have if they've had a lot of antibiotics. A lot of that gut bacteria will have been destroyed. So just a pointer, just as a once-off, if people are taking an antibiotic, they can take a probiotic at the same time. So basically, you're keeping that equilibrium or trying to restore that equilibrium at the same time as you're taking the antibiotic. It won't make the antibiotic any less effective. It will just be trying to keep the good bacteria going. So yes, that's one of the challenges. But it's not just antibiotics that cause damage to the gut. Pesticides also cause damage because they are agents that are meant to affect the hormonal system of the pests that are eating the food that the farmers want to stop being eaten. So when we eat them, they affect our gut bacteria as well and that gut lining. And of course, there's the kind of highly processed foods that don't contain any fiber and contain a lot of sugar that also impact the gut. So a lot of people do think about antibiotics as the first challenge, and of course it is, but there are lots of other things that we do that can also affect the gut. But, there are ways around it. And you say, what can you do? One of the things to do, obviously, is eat those probiotics to replenish the gut. But a better way is to actually eat prebiotics. Now, prebiotics are the kinds of food that the good bacteria love. So we supply a lot of the good food for that bacteria, and then they proliferate. Then they become more plentiful in the gut because they've got more food. So we can affect it actually further, more at a foundational level versus trying to supply the bacteria. We give the good bacteria more food that they can proliferate.
And they have what you're talking about here is of critical importance. And I'm thinking they have such an important role to play, and there's millions, billions of them. I read something somewhere, and I wanted to see if it was true with you. Is it true that over 90% of our body's serotonin, or that happy neurotransmitter, which we talked about in our last episode, that is actually made by our gut microbiome?
Fallon, the percentage researchers aren't 100% sure about. It's between maybe 75 and 80, maybe for some people upwards towards 90, yes. And we call that peripheral serotonin. That means it's made outside of the brain. So it's just as important as the serotonin made in the brain, but it is created in the gut. And of course, the health of the gut will influence how much of that serotonin is made and how much of it actually reaches the bloodstream. So yes, critically important, serotonin. And the thing about serotonin is a lot of researchers say it's the neurotransmitter that's involved with everything, but responsible for nothing. And in that little statement, there's actually a big clue because serotonin is involved in an enormous amount of things that happen. And for example, serotonin is involved in our appetite regulation. So this is interesting. If you don't have the right foundation and the right environment for the right bacteria to be making enough serotonin, then you can start suffering from cravings, and you don't know when you're really full and you don't know when you're really hungry, because serotonin isn't being created to keep that equilibrium there, that hunger, satiation balance. Serotonin is also the foundational compound for melatonin. So if you're not making enough serotonin in your gut because it's not healthy enough, you can't actually have enough of the serotonin required to make melatonin. So then your sleep is affected. Huge problem. And, the third thing is serotonin is involved in equilibrium or emotional equilibrium. So that's why we know that the gut is linked to things like depression and anxiety, because if you're not making enough serotonin there, once again, you're not getting enough into your bloodstream. That also crosses into the brain through the blood-brain barrier. So serotonin has a huge role to play and is responsible for is involved in a whole lot of different functions. But yes, it all relies on that gut having the right nutrients. And just to step back for a moment, people may be saying, okay, but how does this impact the brain? If we don't have enough of the right gut bacteria, our food isn't digested optimally, it's not absorbed optimally. All of the nutrients that we need, all of the macronutrients and the minor nutrients, so we're talking about things like protein, carbohydrates, and fats. We're talking about the vitamins, which are the micronutrients. We're talking about the minerals. Those are all components that need to be present to make the neurotransmitters. So things like, for example, acetylcholine, which is involved in memory consolidation and learning. If we don't have enough of those raw components, we can't make enough acetylcholine. So guess what? Focus, concentration will be hampered. The same with serotonin. We need all of those components together to make serotonin, and to make things like GABA, and to make things like dopamine. So the raw materials that come from the gut, the quality and the quantity of them will impact those neurotransmitters, which are neuronal messengers. So that is how we impact how the brain functions via the food that we eat.
It's amazing. And again, I'm going to plug our last episode. If you didn't get the chance to listen, do go and check out Food for Thought. And also don't forget to pop over to Dr. McCabe's website. There she offers a free gift. And a part of that, it helps give you insight into her personal list of the foods she eats every day to help with those building blocks. And so we're talking about absorption today. And you've just talked and give us a lot of information around serotonin and the role that it plays. Can we talk a little bit more about other things that could happen when your gut ecosystem is out of balance?
Well, a very important thing that happens when the gut ecosystem is out of balance, Fallon, is that we increase the chances of inflammation happening in the body. So let's just explain inflammation for a moment. Inflammation is the body's immune response to something that it doesn't recognize and something that it thinks is an invader. So just as a simple example, if you get a splinter or a thorn in your flesh, the flesh around that thorn will become red. It will become inflamed. Why? Because white blood cells have been sent to the site to eject the enemy, the thorn or the splinter. And then the body will heal beautifully because the enemy will be gone. That's an immune response. Now, in the gut, what happens when that gut lining is no longer functioning really well? And let's just think for a moment, they're very, very tight junctions. So these little junctions need to be tight. These are little cells that are all sitting together very tightly, like little soldiers, and they need to be aware and alert not to let any substances into the bloodstream that will alert the immune system to a foreign invader. And this is a perfect example to show that the gut is actually the first line of defense for the immune system, because anything that we eat could be toxic and mustn't get into our bloodstream because it's going to cause a problem. So guess what happens? When the gut bacteria aren't working really well, they don't make that beautiful layer of mucus that protects that very, very delicate gut lining and doesn't keep it robust anymore. So then what happens? The gut becomes leaky. As I said, we'd mention this again. So those tight little junctions start becoming less tight. And then what happens is that food particles that haven't been properly absorbed get taken into the bloodstream. And guess what? The immune system goes, whoa, there's a problem. And then inflammatory compounds are produced that tell the body it's under threat. So that inflammation is a challenge. Now, if it just stayed in the bloodstream and the body could quickly deal with it, that would be fine. But that isn't what happened. What happens is that these inflammatory compounds, cytokines and others, find their way up to the blood-brain barrier. Now, just as an aside, the blood-brain barrier and the gut lining are very, very similar in a number of ways. They are there to protect, firstly, the bloodstream in relation to the gut lining, and secondly, the blood-brain barrier to protect the brain from compounds that can damage the brain, which is the most sensitive organ we own. So when these inflammatory compounds find their way into the bloodstream, the immune system is now up in arms. There's a problem. That inflammatory response travels all the way to the blood-brain barrier and then causes a problem there, because the same things that damage the gut lining are the same things that damage the blood-brain barrier. And so compromise those very specialized cells that are supposed to keep toxic compounds out. And then that inflammatory response finds its way into the brain. So it's like a fire. It starts damaging everything in its surrounds. And then those neurons that have been impacted, they start behaving poorly. They can't function optimally anymore either, which is why we know that this inflammatory response that actually starts in the gut is hugely damaging for the brain and the very delicate neurons that that rely on staying robust and healthy, and that actually need that blood-brain barrier to stay very, very robust and strong. So this is something for people to really take seriously, because that gut lining, its integrity, is actually in charge of how the brain ends up functioning. Because when it is exposed to all these inflammatory compounds, it can't stay in integrity either. And then it starts breaking down. So it's a complex process, but really quite simple to understand. Our responsibility is to keep that gut lining really as strong and robust as possible, because then we make sure that the blood-brain barrier is also protected.
And so when we're talking about the mucus layer and that barrier, I've heard and been promoted to things about stop leaky gut, make sure you don't have a leaky gut, that kind of thing. Is that what we're talking about here? Is that related?
Absolutely, Fallon. That gut becomes leaky because the gut bacteria aren't producing what they need to produce to keep that gut lining in shape, to keep it healthy. And that happens because of not having the right bacteria. So that can be antibiotics, it can be pesticides, definitely processed foods. So let's speak about that for a moment, because these processed foods have no fiber in them. And guess what? Fiber is what the good bacteria love. Fiber is the prebiotic food they need. So when that refined food becomes a really important part in someone's diet, they're immediately removing a very important food source for the good bacteria. So that's the one thing. But processed food doesn't just come with no fiber. It also comes with a whole lot of other things, a lot of additives, a lot of flavorants, a lot of colorants, a lot of preservatives. All of those things also compromise the gut lining because the bacteria don't know what to do with them. They're causing a challenge for that gut lining, and they're also not providing the right nutrients that the bacteria need and that are required for a lot of other things, not just making neurotransmitters. They're also required to make energy. So that's the other challenge. And then, of course, it comes with a lot of sugar. Now, sugar is also a problem because sugar changes the gut bacteria again, and sugar supports the bad gut bacteria. So something that's really interesting that they've discovered with people who gain a lot of weight and who can't get rid of weight is that they have an overproliferation of a certain kind of bacteria that is very, very good at sucking every single calorie out of the food that we eat, and also wants processed food. So I know this is really a horrible thought for people to think, but the bad gut bacteria are so strong that they can drive our cravings and drive our food choices. So why? Because they want to survive. Those bad gut bacteria want to survive just as much as we want to. So they can drive people's food choices, which will lead to weight gain. So that's something else that happens with the sugar. But on top of all of this, which sounds like a whole lot of bad news, is also stress. Because when we have a lot of stress in our lives, we also have a higher level of cortisol just circulating. And that cortisol also damages the gut lining. So we have a number of different factors that will make the gut leaky and allow partly digested food particles to get into the bloodstream and alert the immune system. So the leaky gut is real, and it can take many weeks for a person to start healing that gut, but it's absolutely possible because our cells in our gut actually replenish themselves every couple of days. So we are capable of doing that, but we do need a concerted effort to do that. And that is, dealing with the bad things and allowing the good bacteria to proliferate by doing the right things.
And so when we talk about some of these right things, something that we were talking about before the show, and also who Ron Shaw, our producer, has been practicing in recent history, is intermittent fasting. What's your verdict on intermittent fasting as a part of, one, just a healthy way to live, and two, letting that microbiome flourish?
Intermittent fasting is a very effective way of giving the gut a chance to rest and allowing the good bacteria to proliferate. One of the challenges we have with modern life is that food is accessible all the time, and a lot of people eat all the time. And if you really think about it, for the body to continuously be digesting, that means digestive enzymes have to be produced. Those gut bacteria never get a chance to rest. They're constantly trying to digest and allow the absorption of that food. It never allows them to actually just settle down, do some healing. Settle down, make sure the mucus lining is working well. Settle down, make sure that the gut is actually functioning really well. So when people have and follow the intermittent fasting process, which is not eating for many hours at a time, and there are different kinds of intermittent diets that people follow, it actually allows the digestive system to rest, and then it actually has a chance to heal. There's one caveat though. When people are very, very stressed, intermittent fasting won't work really well for them, because the body sees hunger or the desire for food as a stress response. So that would raise their adrenaline, raise their cortisol, which is not what we want when we want to heal the gut. So intermittent fasting for people who are really stressed can still be practiced in a lesser way versus going for too many hours without food. And a simple way to do that is just overnight. So if you have your last meal at 6 o'clock at night, and you have your breakfast at maybe 8 or 9, that's a good 12 plus hours that your digestive tract has had a great time to just rest, deal with the food that's in there, work efficiently, get that mucus lining working really well without you feeling stressed, because mostly throughout that time you should be sleeping. However, just to mention something that is important, if your sleep is disrupted, it's really important to deal with that on its own as a separate issue. And that's probably another conversation, but it's important to know that a lack of sleep actually affects our gut bacteria. And researchers discovered this firstly with rats, which they always like to check with rats first.
Always the rats. Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, rats have taught us a lot about human beings simply because their central nervous system is very similar to ours, and their social environment and the way they operate in their little societies is also similar to ours. But importantly, they managed to replicate that research in humans, because they had a look at people that were suffering from jet lag, and they found out that even one night of disrupted sleep impacts the ratio of the good and bad gut bacteria. So if you've been battling with sleep, and really sleep has been a problem for a lot of people during the last 2 plus going on 3 years, it's very important to deal with that, because that will affect your gut bacteria as well. So that's just as an aside, Fallon. But yeah, it's extremely important to deal with these issues, because that gut lining needs to stay robust.
It's amazing how it's all so connected. And I'm quickly thinking back to the beginning of our conversation now, when we were talking about serotonin. It's one that, choose happy, all of these types of things. But you did say something that's stuck in my mind right now, which is the production of serotonin, and making sure that you have enough of it is directly linked to producing enough melatonin, which of course is what helps us fall and stay asleep throughout the night. And people who are stressed, you said they struggle with that. So then it makes sense why they have trouble falling asleep. A thing about stress is, and I think it's entered the collective consciousness, but I see it all over TikTok. It's the new hot thing, stretches, icing, all of these sorts of things about something called the vagus nerve. It sounds like a good time. I'm sure it's less fun than it sounds, but can you tell me a little bit about it? What is it? Why does it matter? And how is it related to what we're talking about today?
It's actually a really important part of this conversation, Fallon. So thank you for mentioning it. And yes, the vagus nerve is an extremely important nerve, because it connects the brain and all the organs that lie within our torso. Let's think about it that way. So vagus is actually Latin for wandering. And it's called the vagus nerve because it wanders between all of these different organs, and it sends information back to the brain. And interestingly, it's a bidirectional relationship, but most of the communication, about 80% of the communication, is from the vagus nerve up to the brain. So we know that what's going on in our organs is continuously informing the brain of how the body feels. So when we stimulate the vagus nerve in a positive way, we tell the brain everything is good. Everything is working well. Everything is good down here. Relax, be calm. When the vagus nerve is stimulated by us being really stressed, by our heart pounding, by us having a lot of cortisol running through our body, and also by our gut not working well, it sends a message to the brain that says things aren't going well. There's a problem down here. What are you going to do about it? So we actually need to focus on keeping ourselves calm consciously, which is a mindset approach, but also allowing our body to relax. making sure our gut works really well, stimulating our heart muscle, but not overly in terms of exercise and stress, and making sure that we breathe very well, because our lungs also send messages up to our brain. So, for example, if we breathe very shallowly, it sends a message to the brain: this body is panicking. This body is in a vigilant mode. This body isn't coping well. The brain goes, what should I do about that? But just remember, 80% of the communication is going upwards from the vagus nerve to the brain. So we have to work on the body to tell the brain we're okay, as much as we have to work on mindset. So we are still at the early days of discovering how important this vagus nerve is. But we do know that this embodied cognition, which is the technical term for it, this means cognition that is taking place because of what's going on in the body. We know it's a very, very important part of keeping ourselves healthy, physically and mentally. But also we know that the gut bacteria plays a, as yet, perfectly understood role in telling the brain things are okay, things are under control. And, you know, you mentioned the butterflies earlier. And I like to tell the story about my daughter. She was getting ready to speak on stage, and we were busy, you know, teaching her how to do this to build her confidence. And it was just part of what we thought was important for teaching our children, to be able to stand up in front of people and speak. And we were speaking about the feeling that you get, that fear that you get before you do that. And I said, it's butterflies in your stomach, isn't it? And she said, no, Mom, it's bats. So that was a good example for me, even at that stage in my research career, to figure out that these feelings that originate from the brain definitely work with the gut. And then because she thought it was bats, it was such an overwhelming experience for her. The message to her brain was, this is very fearful. This is very scary. What am I going to do about this? So when we become aware of these feelings and what's actually going on in our body, that's part of what the vagus nerve is responding to and telling the brain what's happening. And one of the ways is, you know, these really cold showers. It stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is linked to the vagus nerve, which tells the body everything's okay, relax and calm down. Although, once again, a caveat, if you're feeling a lot of stress, those cold showers may not be a great idea, because the first feeling you may get is a rush of adrenaline. So just edge into those cold showers really slowly if you've been feeling very stressed. And do a lot of singing, humming, even gargling with water stimulates the vagus nerve as well.
That is so fascinating to me. And as you're talking about these things, I think back to a conversation that I had with Paul, who was driving me to the airport one day. I do a little bit of travel for our work, and he's from Ghana. And it was right around the peak of COVID. And we got talking, long story short, he and his entire family, to help ward off COVID, they eat specific foods. They make specific teas. And we got talking about so many of these amazing ancient cultures. Look, all over Asia, different countries in Africa, so many of these ancient cultures, I feel like they've known this for a while, like this connection between what we eat and our mind and that kind of thing. Tell me a little bit about your opinion on that as well.
I think this is a very important part of the conversation, because I do believe that a lot of these ancient cultures and some of these traditional approaches do work, but they may not work for the reason that people think they work. But that doesn't mean they're not effective, for the simple reason that the placebo effect is a hugely, hugely underrated part of our psyche. So if you really believe that something's going to work and you believe in the process, what that does, that actually lowers your stress response. And when your stress response is lowered, your immune system isn't on high alert. And that means that it will actually stay healthier for longer, because when we're very, very stressed, our immune system is compromised. So many of these old traditions, maybe the tea doesn't actually have any mechanistic function of improving the immune system, but drinking the tea and believing that it does actually does help the nervous system calm down and relax. So that's one part of it. The second part is that some of these traditional medicines have actually been shown to be dangerous. And that's a different conversation, because some of them are actually toxic. So it's not that they all work, and that there's this ancient wisdom that has, proliferated under our noses. It's not really that. Some of them have been found to be toxic, but the ones that do work may not work because of the actual compound. It may work just because of what it does to the central nervous system. But having said all of that, Fallon, there is a lot that nature can give us and provide us. If we think about the normal dispirin, it comes from the willow bark, and that's a plant which we found was really effective. Obviously, not all modern medicine ascribes to that, but I think if we take some of the ancient traditions that aren't dangerous, and we take modern medicine and we combine the two in the best possible way, plus making sure we keep our body as healthy as possible through the right foods and our mindset and physical exercise and great sleep, then we have the best of all the worlds. But I think relying on any one thing alone isn't the solution. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it's such great advice. We're going to talk about hacks next. And I think that it's part of the human condition. We're always, better, faster, stronger. And, how can we do this quickly? And a lot of people are looking to do those types of things, especially when they find something that takes a significant investment in time. Now, this is a really complex topic, and it's so interrelated. What are some of your top tips or hacks on somebody who wants to take action now?
Okay, we're going to start with one, which is a little icky to talk about, but it's an important part of this conversation, and it needs to be the first one, because this will give us a lot of information about what to do following this. So let's talk about something called transit time. Transit time is the time that it takes from when you eat a food to when the waste product of that food leaves your body. Okay. So transit time is very important, because we need the right transit time, because we need food to be exposed to the gut lining for a certain period of time to allow the breakdown of the food and then the absorption of that food. If the food goes through too quickly, there's not enough time for that food to be digested and absorbed optimally. If it goes too slowly, what happens is the food starts putrefying. It actually goes rotten in the gut. And then what happens is we don't absorb the good nutrients. We actually end up absorbing toxic compounds, and the gut lining becomes compromised. So transit time is a very important thing to figure out. So let's, as a first step, do that. And a simple way to do that is to simply drink a little bit of water into which you've stirred a tablespoon of white sesame seeds. Now, I know that this sounds really icky, but what you do, you stir the sesame seeds into the water, you drink that, and it's best to do it probably in the morning, and then you write it down. Put it in your phone, put it in your diary, whatever you do, and then every single time you go and you open your bowels, have a look in the toilet and see when you see those sesame seeds. Now, if it's between 12 and 17 hours, give or take a little, you're doing well. That means that from beginning to end, that food is getting enough time to be digested and absorbed. Okay. If it's longer than 17 hours, then you know it's staying in there too long. And then you need to do some other things to get it moving faster. Okay, so that's just a first hack. And it's really simple, and it doesn't take a lot of effort. It just takes you being really observant. So if anybody hasn't looked at their bowel movement, this is a perfect opportunity to do so. And I know that people don't like talking about this, but it's a really important part of the discussion. As you can see from this conversation, what's happening in your gut is affecting your brain. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two is very few people eat enough fiber today. It just isn't part of our society, and it's not part of the food that's available. So make sure the food that you choose is nutrient dense, colorful if possible, because that means it's got a lot of antioxidants in, which we spoke about at our last chat, and also got a lot of fiber in it. Then you know that you're providing a lot of food, the prebiotics, for these bacteria we want to proliferate. And on top of that, add fermented foods. These are things like kimchi, things like sauerkraut, but they must be properly fermented. They're not put into vinegar, fake fermented. They need to actually be fermented in the old traditional way, and that's using brine, which is salted water. And then they allow the vegetables to break down and the bacteria from the air helps those vegetables break down and supplies wonderful bacteria for the gut. So kimchi, sauerkraut, as I mentioned, even yogurt. I use coconut yogurt, and you can use specific foods that have a lot of prebiotics in them. And my favorite one is artichokes. And I make hummus with artichoke hearts, and it's fantastic. So
delicious. Those are good tips. I don't want to take you off track, but when somebody says like fermented foods, my brain automatically goes to fermented drinks. Now, you can't go anywhere without seeing kombucha. Give us the hot take on that before we move on to the next tip.
Look, kombucha is better than sugary sodas and better than sugary fruit drinks, okay? But kombucha is really a marketing dream, because people buy kombucha thinking it's got a whole lot of good bacteria in it, and it's really minimal. So don't rely on kombucha for your good gut bacteria in any way, shape, or form. Focus on the food, and then just have kombucha on top, as like the cherry on top, but no reliance on kombucha. Sorry, those are just the facts. And also, some of the kombucha can still have sugar left over that hasn't been digested by the bacteria, so that can also not be great for us.
Yeah, and people at home who are thinking about making their own kombucha, I mean, be very careful. I've heard lots of people being poisoned by their own SCOBY, so look out.
Yeah, look, I tried that, and I just looked at it and thought, look, I'm not an expert in this, you know. I don't try and look after my own teeth. I go to the dentist. If people are going to make this and they're going to make it perfectly, and they've got, you know, OH&S looking after it, I'm perfectly happy to buy it from them. And I do occasionally. But I definitely don't rely on that to keep my gut healthy. So yes, if you're making it at home, beware. And the third point, Fallon, you know, it brings us back to this mind and physiology connection. The feeling of stress and overwhelm that people have, it affects their breathing. Then it affects their digestion. Because what does the digestive system do when we get really stressed? It stops. Because the focus is on getting away from that tiger. Now, we know that this is a metaphorical tiger. You know, we're not running away from a real one anymore. But there are a lot of things going on in our society and in our environment that tell the brain, the ancient stress response, that we need to get away from that. And so immediately, the stress response will kick in, and the digestive system will definitely stop functioning optimally. So it's extremely important for us to address stress and our mindset. And there are a number of ways that one can do that, but it needs to be done. And in my checklist that you spoke about earlier, which is my free gift, which I practice the things in that checklist every day myself. That helps us ground ourselves. That helps us stop that overwhelming stress response, which just seems to be part of modern life and that we need to become resilient to. When we do that, that vagus nerve tells the brain, guess what? This body's calm. This body's got things under control. This digestive system isn't hampered by this overwhelming adrenaline and cortisol response. So those are the three things that I think people need to just focus on. Once we do that, we can make sure that our digestive system functions really well. We can start breathing deeply. We're eating the right kinds of food. Mindset is really good. And that transit time, do that first. That'll give you a lot of information. And from there, people can progress really well.
That is absolutely fantastic. Before we finish up today, I'd love for you to recap for us something that I personally love and learned from you, and it's entered into how I refer to things, which is not talking about things as like stress reduction or stress management, but really talking about building stress resilience. Can you tell us a little bit about your position on that?
You know, Fallon, when I started doing research into specifically the female brain, and I'd just like to mention here as an aside that the female brain and the digestive system are different or operate in a slightly different way to the male brain and the digestive system, because our hormones are linked to serotonin production in the gut. So for women, the transit time is generally a little bit longer. So just keep that in mind. And I just thought I'd mention that as an aside. But when I did a deep dive into the stress response and I started looking at what it really does to our physiology, it really brought me up quite startlingly to the realization that the whole idea of stress management is really quite outdated, because trying to manage stress is like trying to manage a python. We actually need to become stress resilient. We actually need to step up in a new way, because we really do live in a very complex society today that we have created for ourselves. And life is never going to get less complex. It's only going to get more so. And in that process, if we don't step up, all we're going to be doing is standing on the back foot, trying to catch up continuously. We really need to make a very conscious effort to become stress resilient. And that means working on our mindset and working on our physiology so that we don't succumb to the stress in the same way. It means we need to think differently about what we tackle and what we respond to. It means we need to be very, very conscious about the food that we eat. It means we need to be very conscious about what we surround ourselves with, because all of those things impact our capacity to step up and be the best versions of ourselves. So I speak about resilience a lot more. And my focus is on becoming strong enough to cope in this complex world versus continuously trying to manage something, which we're never going to manage. I think it's possible for us to get to the point where we are strong enough and we disciplined enough and we are capable enough to say, no, I'm not getting involved in that. I don't want to see that online. I don't want to watch the news. I'm choosing to live my life in this way, because in this way I stay resilient.
So perfect, and something that even in my home that we're starting to focus on is how can we give our children the tools and resilience and exposing them to the real world in a way and giving them the tools they need to be resilient. Delia, it is always an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing your big, beautiful brain with us and your beautiful soul. I always have such an amazing time every time I get to talk to you. Everybody, do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Hear more from Dr. McCabe. Head over to her website, read her book, Feed Your Brain. It'll change your life. Don't forget to go and get her opt-in gift, which is that special checklist that we talked about, and that's available on her website. And most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, go and get those sesame seeds out. Let's all check our transit time and take the first step to fixing that and improving that mind-gut connection. Thank you, Delia.
Such a pleasure, Fallon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.